When David Connors first signed on for the excavation project, it felt like winning the lottery. For years, he had slogged through underfunded infrastructure contracts and private sector projects that never paid enough to justify the long hours. Then came the offer, a six-figure salary, immediate clearance upgrades, and a signing bonus big enough to pay off his mortgage twice over. It seemed too good to be true. David still remembered the day the contract was delivered to his doorstep. The man who handed it over wore a plain suit, carried no identification, and spoke as if reading from a script. He didn't linger after David signed, nor did he explain much beyond the basics. Restricted work site, total confidentiality, guaranteed security clearance. David shrugged off the man's robotic demeanor. What did it matter if he had to keep quiet? With this kind of money, he wouldn't need another job for the rest of his life. The flight to Nevada was uneventful, and David found himself taken by how ordinary everything seemed. When he arrived, a white van waited for him on the tarmac, its windows tinted so dark that the desert sunlight barely penetrated the glass. The driver didn't speak. The drive into the barren, featureless expanse felt endless. And then, without warning, they arrived. The base's above-ground facilities were so mundane, they were almost disappointing. Flat, featureless buildings surrounded by fencing and guards. There was no sign of the top-secret alien tech that conspiracy theorists loved to talk about. Just sand, concrete, and security cameras. David was escorted into what he assumed was the main administrative building. Inside, a man in a grey uniform briefed him with the same emotionless tone as the courier who delivered his contract. No personal devices, no communication with the outside world, no questions about the purpose of the project. Everything you need to know will be provided on a need-to-know basis, the man said flatly, handing him a badge. Report to Tunnel Access 4 tomorrow morning. When David asked what exactly they'd be excavating, the man replied only, "You'll see." That first week was tedious. David and his team were put through training that felt less like orientation and more like indoctrination. Every day they descended deeper into the desert, their equipment carving tunnels into the earth. The heat was suffocating, even hundreds of feet underground. The air felt thick, tinged with a faint metallic taste. David thought it might be the machinery, but something about it seemed off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. The other engineers didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they kept it to themselves. The team wasn't particularly social. Most conversations revolved around technical details, ground stability, equipment failures, deadlines. By the end of each day, everyone seemed too drained to talk about anything else. David chalked it up to the exhausting conditions. Then one day, their drill hit something. At first, it seemed like just another cavern. The walls were unnaturally smooth, almost polished. David ran his hand across the surface, expecting to feel the familiar grit of sandstone or limestone. Instead, it was cold, colder than it should have been, given the desert heat. And it felt weird. Not metal, not stone, not glass. Something in between. When he pointed this out to the site supervisor, the man's expression didn't change. "Continue the excavation," was all he said. As the team widened the breach, strange things started happening. The air grew colder, the faint metallic tang now so strong it made some of the workers nauseous. A faint vibration seemed to hum through the walls, subtle at first but growing more pronounced each day. Tools left overnight would vanish, only to reappear hours later in places no one had been. A heavy wrench was found bent almost in half, as though exposed to immense heat, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. One night, David stayed late to review a set of ground-penetrating radar scans. The images on the monitor didn't make sense. The cavern below wasn't just one chamber. It stretched downwards, splitting off into a network of passages. The scans suggested that it wasn't empty. There were shapes, vague, distorted forms that seemed to move slightly between each pass of the radar. It had to be a glitch, he told himself. Equipment this old wasn't always reliable. "Hey, Connors," said another engineer who had wandered in. "You working late too?" "Yeah," David replied, keeping his eyes on the screen. "These readings are strange." The other engineer peered over his shoulder. "What are those shapes? Fishes?" David hesitated. "I don't think so. They're too uniform. Look." He pointed to one of the images. "They're symmetrical, like pillars almost, or structures." "Structures," the engineer frowned. "That doesn't make any sense. This whole area should be solid rock. There's no record of—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. "Look, maybe the equipment's just acting up. You know how it is. Old gear, lots of interference." David wanted to push further, but the man's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Over the next few days, security at the site increased. Armed guards now patrolled the excavation area, something David hadn't seen before. Rumors began circulating among the crew. Hushed whispers about something the military had found down there. Some workers claimed to have heard voices, faint and distorted, echoing through the tunnels. Others swore they saw shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. Then came the quarantine. One afternoon, after the team had broken through to a particularly large chamber, all non-military personnel were told to evacuate. "Biohazard protocols," the supervisor said. David and a handful of others were confined to a makeshift quarantine unit on the surface. For days, they were subjected to medical examinations and constant monitoring. The doctors never explained what they were looking for. When David was finally allowed back on site, the atmosphere had changed. The military presence was overwhelming. The civilian workers were kept on a strict schedule, allowed only in designated areas, and forbidden from speaking to anyone outside their immediate team. The chamber they'd uncovered was now off limits. One night, while on a routine equipment check, David heard something that stopped him in his tracks. It was faint at first, just a low hum, almost like machinery. But as he listened, it became clear that it wasn't mechanical. It was a sound, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very walls, and within it, something else. A voice. It wasn't speaking English. David wasn't even sure it was speaking words at all. It was a strange, guttural chant that made his chest tighten. He felt a wave of nausea, his head swimming. The hum grew louder, the voice more insistent. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with that eerie, otherworldly sound. Suddenly, the lights in the tunnel flickered. David's flashlight beam trembled as his hands shook. For a brief moment, the shadows ahead seemed to move, not in a natural way, but as if they were crawling, shifting, sliding along the walls. "Connors, you all right?" a voice called out from behind. David turned sharply to see one of the guards. "Yeah," he stammered. "Just thought I heard something." The guard's expression was unreadable. "You didn't hear anything," he said firmly. "Let's move." David didn't argue, but he knew what he'd heard and he knew what he'd seen. The next morning, David tried to access the chamber's security footage, only to find his credentials revoked. His supervisor informed him that his clearance had been downgraded, effective immediately. "Focus on your assigned tasks," the man said coldly. From that point on, David was watched closely. Guards monitored his every move, and he was assigned to surface-level duties that kept him away from the excavation site. But at night, he still heard the hum, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It followed him even after he returned to the surface, as if the sound was burned into his mind. It was weeks before David made his next move. With careful planning, he managed to gain access to an old terminal that still had limited clearance. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Internal documents detailing something called Project Stygian. The files were heavily redacted, but certain phrases stood out. Subterranean life forms, genetic experimentation, containment failure. David's last act before disappearing was sending an anonymous tip to a journalist he trusted. The journalist later claimed that the email was corrupted. Lines of gibberish mixed with fragments of coherent text. One phrase appeared over and over. "It's awake." David was never heard from again. Nick Holt leaned against the chain-link fence, a pair of scratched binoculars pressed to his face. From his perch near the airport's edge, he had an unobstructed view of the Janet Airlines terminal, a bland, windowless structure tucked away from the commercial gates. The planes themselves were unassuming at first glance, ordinary white Boeing 737s. But once you knew what to look for, they stood out. Each one bore a single, bold red stripe along its fuselage. Nick watched as a white bus with tinted windows pulled up. The passengers filed out, moving like shadows, silent, uniform detached. They wore plain clothes, carried no luggage, and never looked back toward the city. None of them spoke. None of them hesitated. It was as if they were drawn toward the planes by some unseen force. Nick had spent the last few months investigating Janet Airlines, driven by the rumors that had circulated for years. Officially, it was a classified commuter service that ferried government workers to undisclosed locations. Unofficially, it was a shuttle to Area 51. The conspiracy forums called it everything from the alien bus line to the whisper fleet. Nick had heard stories of passengers who never returned. He'd read accounts of strange noises echoing from the planes during takeoff, of black-suited men escorting passengers who didn't appear entirely human. And yet, no one had ever taken a ride on one of these planes and lived to tell about it. At least, not publicly. Nick adjusted his binoculars, following the line of passengers as they climbed the boarding ramp. The faint smell of jet fuel and desert air mingled, dry and acrid. A soft breeze rustled the tumbleweeds behind him, the only sound in the eerie silence of the airport's off-limits section. He noted the passengers' expressions, or lack thereof. Their faces were blank, devoid of curiosity or nervousness. No one checked their phones. No one chatted. It was as if they weren't really there. Something cold and prickling crawled up Nick's spine. He'd been a journalist for years, chasing down stories that no one else dared touch, but this felt different. He wasn't just exposing corruption or corporate cover-ups. He was peering into something much darker, something he couldn't yet define. His fingers brushed against the ID badge clipped to his jacket, a badge he'd borrowed from a careless airport technician. He hadn't planned to use it, not yet. But as the last passenger disappeared into the plane, Nick felt an impulse he couldn't resist. This was his chance. His one chance. He ducked behind a parked fuel truck, heart pounding, and approached the boarding gate from the side. A uniformed guard stood by the entrance, scanning each ID with a handheld reader. Nick's mouth was dry, his pulse roaring in his ears. What if the badge didn't work? What if they caught him? But when his turn came, the guard barely glanced at the badge before nodding him through. The boarding ramp was strangely quiet. The lights overhead flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows on the steel walls. The air smelled different, sterile, metallic, and faintly chemical, as if the space had been scrubbed too thoroughly. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't see any airline crew, no flight attendants or gate agents, only a lone security officer standing at the plane's door. "Welcome aboard," the officer said, his voice flat and mechanical. His eyes lingered on Nick for a moment too long, but he eventually stepped aside. The cabin inside was colder than Nick expected, the air conditioning cranked up to an unnatural degree. He found a seat near the rear and sank into it, trying to steady his breathing. The other passengers were already seated, each staring straight ahead, their hands resting lightly on their thighs. Their posture was perfect, their movements synchronized. Nick's throat tightened. He'd been expecting something strange, but this was unsettling on a level he hadn't prepared for. The plane's interior was eerily bare. The walls were metallic, with no windows, no overhead compartments, and no safety instructions in the seat-back pockets. The seats were all the same dull grey, lined up in perfect sterile rows. He shifted uncomfortably, his skin prickling at the cold air blowing through the vents. A low hum began to fill the cabin, growing steadily louder. Nick glanced around, hoping to catch the eye of another passenger, but no one moved. They sat motionless, like mannequins. The hum wasn't coming from the engines, at least not the engines Nick was familiar with. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like a vibration you could feel in your bones. Janet Flight 91 is now departing. Please prepare for transport. The voice came from the speakers overhead, calm and detached, but something about it sent a chill down Nick's spine. The plane began to move, taxiing down the runway. Nick gripped the armrests as the hum intensified. As the plane took off, the lights in the cabin dimmed, then flickered. For a brief moment, everything went dark. Nick felt a lurch in his stomach, the kind that comes from sudden turbulence, but there was no sound of air rushing past the windows, no familiar roar of jet engines, just the hum. Louder now, stronger. When the lights came back on, something was different. Nick looked around the cabin, his pulse quickening. The passengers were still there, still sitting perfectly still, but their faces seemed wrong. Subtle changes. Their skin looked pale, almost translucent. Their eyes, their eyes seemed darker. Too dark. He blinked, shaking his head, convincing himself it was a trick of the light. He needed answers. He needed proof. Nick reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. He wasn't supposed to have it, but he'd kept it on airplane mode, hoping to snap a few photos discreetly. He aimed it at the nearest passenger, a woman with shoulder-length hair and a blank stare. The screen went static. Not black, not off, just static like an old analog TV. A faint, garbled whisper filled the air, almost too quiet to hear. Nick froze. The woman turned her head slowly, her black eyes locking onto his. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. The whispering grew louder, the words still unintelligible but pressing into his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The hum became a roar, and then in an instant, everything went silent. The lights flickered again, and the cabin was empty. Nick bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. The other passengers were gone. Their seats were empty, the cabin eerily quiet. He stumbled into the aisle, looking around frantically. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The air felt thicker now, colder. The metallic walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Nick walked toward the front of the cabin, each step feeling like a struggle. The hum returned, low and steady, almost like a heartbeat. "Nick!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. He whipped around, but no one was there. "Nick," it said again, softer this time, almost a whisper. His legs felt like lead as he moved forward. The cockpit door was ajar, light spilling through the crack. With trembling hands, he pushed it open. Inside was not a cockpit. It was something else entirely, a vast, glowing chamber that seemed far larger than the plane itself. Strange symbols lined the walls, pulsating with light. In the center, a massive, translucent structure floated in mid-air, glowing faintly blue. Shapes swirled within it, shifting, coalescing into forms that almost looked human before dissolving again. And then he saw them. The passengers, or what was left of them. Their bodies hung suspended in the glowing structure, their features twisted, their forms stretched and distorted. They pulsed with the light, as if they were part of it now. Nick stumbled backward, his mind screaming for him to run, to get out, but the doorway behind him was gone. The hum grew louder, the light brighter. The last thing he saw was his reflection in the pulsating wall, a reflection that wasn't his anymore. The summer of 1947 was unrelenting. Dry heat rippled over the barren New Mexico desert, the air shimmering like molten glass. The land seemed timeless, unmoving, indifferent to the war that had ended only a few years earlier and the uneasy peace that had followed. It was just before sunset on a typical July evening when rancher Mac Brazel noticed something unusual scattered across his grazing land. He had seen thunderstorms roll through the previous night, unusual for the season but not unheard of. What was strange wasn't the storm, it was what it left behind. As Mac's truck bounced over the uneven terrain, his eyes caught glints of light, reflecting off something unnatural in the distance. He killed the engine and stepped out, the desert silence engulfing him like a blanket. There was no sound except the faint whistle of the wind and the crunch of gravel under his boots. That's when he saw it. The field was littered with debris, strange and metallic, unlike anything Mac had ever seen. There were thin, silvery sheets that crumpled in his hands like paper, but immediately sprang back to their original form when he released them. He knelt to examine another piece, lightweight, yet it seemed as strong as steel. Nearby lay longer beams with odd symbols etched into their surfaces, symbols that made Mac's head ache if he stared at them too long. His horse wouldn't come near the wreckage, stomping and whinnying at the edge of the field. The animal's reaction set Mac's nerves on edge. He'd lived his whole life in the desert. He'd seen downed aircraft before. But this was something else. He thought about going straight to the sheriff, but something about the debris felt personal, dangerous. He loaded a few of the smaller pieces into his truck and drove toward Roswell, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long and dark across the land. The cool night air didn't calm him. In fact, it only heightened the eerie feeling that something was watching him, unseen, from the open desert. The sheriff's office was quiet when Mac arrived. Sheriff George Wilcox was just finishing up his evening coffee, a weary man whose years of dealing with drunken cowhands and cattle disputes had left him skeptical of anything out of the ordinary. Mac placed a piece of the debris on Wilcox's desk with a thud, and the sheriff's casual demeanor melted into confusion. "What's this?" Wilcox asked, poking at the metal with a calloused finger. "I don't know," Mac said, his voice low. "Found it out on the ranch. There's more of it. Lots more. I've never seen anything like it." Wilcox picked up the sheet, turning it over. "Lightweight," he muttered, bending it slightly. It snapped back to its original shape. "That ain't aluminum." "No," Mac agreed. "It's not." The sheriff frowned. "You're sure this came from a plane?" Mac hesitated. "I don't know what it came from. It didn't look like any plane I've ever seen." Wilcox leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his chin. He looked out the window where the streetlights cast long shadows across the dusty road. "Wait here," he said finally, getting up. He went to the back office and returned with a phone book, thumbing through it quickly before dialing a number on the rotary phone. "This is Wilcox. I need to speak to the folks out at the Army airfield," he said. He gave them a brief rundown, then hung up. "They'll send someone. You might want to head home, Mac." Mac looked at the sheriff, a strange chill running down his spine. What are they going to do? "Don't know," Wilcox said, "but it's out of my hands now." It didn't take long for the military to arrive. The next day, men in uniforms descended on Mac's ranch, their vehicles kicking up dust clouds that hung in the air long after they parked. Soldiers spread out, collecting every last scrap of debris, their faces set in stern, unreadable expressions. Mac tried to ask questions, but the officers only gave him vague reassurances. Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer from the nearby Roswell Army airfield, took over the operation. Marcel wasn't the kind of man who spooked easily. He'd seen war, handled classified materials, and prided himself on his professionalism. But as he walked among the debris field, a weight settled on his chest. This wasn't just strange, it was impossible. The materials didn't belong to any aircraft in the US arsenal, nor did they resemble anything he'd heard about from foreign intelligence. The symbols etched into the beams made his temples throb. When he picked up a piece of the silvery fabric, it felt almost alive in his hands, as if it vibrated at the edges of perception. Marcel's instincts screamed at him to take the findings seriously. He loaded his car with samples and drove back to the base that evening, thinking carefully about what he would report. The tires of his car crunched over gravel as the headlights illuminated the desert road ahead. The night was oppressively silent. No crickets, no coyotes, just the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind against the windshield. Something about the quiet unnerved him. By the time he reached the base, the questions were already swirling in his mind. What had crashed in that field? And why did he feel an unshakable sense of dread, as though he'd just witnessed something that no human was supposed to see? The military wasted no time. Within hours, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release stating they had recovered a flying disc. The story hit the newspapers, causing a flurry of excitement and speculation. But the celebration was short-lived. By the next day, the Army had retracted the statement, replacing it with a much more mundane explanation. It was nothing more than a weather balloon. Marcel was instructed to toe the official line, but he knew better. He couldn't shake the image of the materials, the symbols, the way they seemed to defy explanation. In the following days, the debris disappeared. Trucks loaded with the wreckage rolled out under heavy guard, their destination unknown. Witnesses reported seeing aircraft leaving Roswell in the dead of night, heading toward Wright Field in Ohio. But some said the ultimate destination wasn't Ohio at all. It was a remote base in the Nevada desert, a place that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for years to come. Area 51. The rumors didn't stop. Civilians who had gotten a glimpse of the crash site spoke of small, frail bodies carried away on stretchers. Nurses and doctors at the local base hospital whispered about autopsies conducted behind closed doors. The descriptions were consistent: grayish skin, large heads, oversized black eyes, the kind of details that could ruin careers and livelihoods if spoken aloud. Over the decades, bits and pieces of information leaked out. Whistleblowers, former military personnel, and even a few retired scientists claimed to have worked on the materials recovered from Roswell. They described labs built deep beneath the desert floor, where the air was cold and still, and where the faint hum of machines never ceased. They spoke of experiments, tests designed not only to understand the alien technology, but to replicate it, to harness it, to use it. Some said the materials found at Roswell were more than just advanced metals. They were biological, living. When exposed to certain conditions, they moved, almost as if responding to stimuli. The beams with symbols? Some claimed the symbols glowed faintly in complete darkness, as if resonating with an unseen energy. And then there were the whispers. Stories of entire research teams falling ill after prolonged exposure. Their skin pale, their voices hoarse, their eyes haunted by things they refused to discuss. And yet, the official story never changed. Roswell was a balloon, nothing more. But those who had seen the debris, those who had stood in that field or worked in the hidden labs, they knew better. The Roswell crash wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much larger. Something that didn't stop in 1947. Something that may still be happening today, deep underground, where no one can see, and where the truth is far darker than anyone dares to imagine. Thank you for watching this video by Sanctum Obscura. If you enjoyed unraveling the darkness with us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some mysteries are better left in the shadows. See you next time.